Hi everyone, this is Shimiri, and welcome back to Aretuza Academy. Today we're going to be talking about provisions or recruit cost, which is this number up here in the deck builder. Each deck is limited to 165 provisions, and that's to make sure that decks have relatively the same amount of value contained within them, and no deck has too much more power than any other decks. But when we're building a deck, we want to make sure we can cram in as much value as possible. So how do we do that? We want to put in cards that have a high ratio of value to provision cost. In general, the rule of thumb is that if a card can get more value than its provision cost, then it might be worth putting into your deck. So a vanilla card, for example, like Elder Bear, it has no ability, it costs 6 provisions, but it only gives you 5 value. So in most cases, you're not going to want to put a card like this into your deck. Remember, the more value or the higher ratio of value to provisions a card has, the more likely it'll help you win a game. So how do we get cards with higher value than their provisions? Well, there's a few different ways. There are engines, there are cards that have synergy with other cards, and then there are control cards that help you deal with opponents' threats. So let's talk about engines first. Engines are cards that might have a lower strength than its provision cost initially, but it will gain value over time by either buffing or dealing damage over every turn. If those cards are not answered quickly, you can gain a lot of value for its provision cost, and they can become all of a sudden really efficient. You can rate the quality of an engine by the amount of turns you need to overcome the ratio between the provision cost and its strength. And the fewer turns that it takes to pass that 1-to-1 threshold, the better engine it is generally. So let's take a look at a couple engines. Alright, here we go. So we've got 2 different engines here. We have Magni Division and Eskel Pathfinder. They're very similar. Let's take a look at Magni Division first. It is a 4 provision card, 3 base strength, but every turn on turn end, if it is the only card on the row, it boosts self by 1. So if it satisfies this condition, it gains 1 every turn. If you're able to keep that row clear, then you can get, in a long 10 card round, for example, you can get 13 value from this Magni Division in a 10 card round. That's a little bit unlikely, but it only takes 1 or 2 turns for this card to get over its provision cost of 4. You put it down, it's a 3, it immediately goes to a 4, and then it only needs to stick for 1 more turn to get 5 value. So it's very easy to satisfy the 1-to-1 value to provision ratio with this card. Now let's take a look at Eskel Pathfinder. It does very similar effect to Magni Division. Its condition is that it needs to be on the melee row, and then it'll just boost itself by 1 every turn. It starts at 6 base strength, and it costs 10 provisions. So it takes 4 turns for Eskel to get to that 1-to-1 value to provisions ratio, which is a little bit longer than Magni Division, making Magni Division the more efficient engine here. There are other things to consider, however, such as how easy it is to remove an engine. Eskel has more base strength than Magni Division, so it's harder to remove, and it also has an easier condition to satisfy. Magni Division, it's not likely that you're going to have a super long round and never have to play anything else in this row. So those are some other things to consider when you think about which card you want to put into your deck. So moving on to the second category, we have synergy cards. Synergy cards are another good way to find more value than the provision cost for cards. These kind of cards are not necessarily impressive by themselves, but when they're played together with other cards, they can gain a lot of value. A great example would be to combine a Death Wish unit like Harpy Egg with a unit that consumes, such as Barbagazi. We can take a look at those. Deathwish Harpy Egg, it has a 5 provision card for only 3 power, which isn't great on face value, but when the Harpy Egg dies, it summons a Harpy, a 5 strength Harpy, so it can potentially get 8 value for its 5 provisions if there's something that kills or consumes this harpy egg. And Barbagazi is something that can do it. Barbagazi is also by itself 5 strength for 6 provisions, not great. But if you consume a harpy egg with this, then all of a sudden you're getting 5 plus 3 plus another 5, 13 total value over a total of 11 provisions. 6 provisions for the Barbagazi, 5 provisions for the harpy egg. So that becomes pretty efficient. And you even have another consume charge left over for further synergy with other cards. Another example of synergy combination could be Northern Realms between Tridem Infantry, for example. Tridem Infantry and Kedweni Sergeant. Tridem Infantry is a 3 strength, 4 provision card, but whenever this unit receives a boost, damage a random enemy by 1. And Kedweni Sergeant is a unit that can boost an ally by 1 twice. So if you use those 2 boosts on the Tridem Infantry, all of a sudden the Tridem Infantry is sort of worth 5 value for 4 provisions. And that's pretty efficient. Okay, and the third category we're talking about here are control cards. Control cards are the opposite of engine cards. These cards try to gain value by dealing with your opponent's threats before they hit their full potential. So for example, you can lock an engine, you can deal damage and remove an engine, or you can just straight up destroy an engine. These sort of cards, for example, are like Alba Armored Cavalry from the Nilfgaard faction. This card is 5 provisions with 3 strength, and it locks an enemy unit on deploy. So if you're not locking an enemy unit, this is not a very efficient card at all. You're only getting 3 points for 5 provisions. But if you can lock a threatening engine, for example, like Magni Division that we talked about earlier, from growing, if you lock it early and you prevent it from growing for example, say 5 turns, then all of a sudden this Alba Armored Cavalry has gotten you 3 plus 5 values for a total of 8 value, only 5 provisions, and that becomes very efficient. Outside of locks, you can also damage engines. So if we're still talking about something like Tridem Infantry, it comes down initially 3 power, as we saw earlier. Before they have a chance to buff it up, if you're able to remove it through damage with a card like Vrayhead Officer, on the melee row, it damages an enemy by 3. So normally this card would be 5 for 5 if you choose the damage or the boost option. 2 plus the 3, 5 for 5, which is okay. But if you're removing an enemy engine with a 3 damage, then all of a sudden any sort of extra value or removing a synergy card such as the Tridem Infantry, any sort of extra value the Tridem Infantry would have gotten through synergy is now gone. And effectively, you've gotten maybe like 7 points for 5 provisions. Finally, you can just straight up destroy things that can get more value over time, such as artifacts. Common way to get value over time these days is through artifacts such as Master Crafted Spear. This is something that initially plays for 0 strength, but will get you at least one value per turn that it's on the board by damaging and setting up other synergies or setting up other combos. And if you're able to remove an artifact with something like Battering Ram, if you control a soldier, destroy an enemy artifact, it costs 5 provisions with 4 strength. But if you're able to remove that Mastercrafted Spear with the Battering Ram, you've all of a sudden gotten a ton of upside with this card. Probably something around like 12 value for 5 provisions. On the other hand, though, if you are facing a matchup with no artifacts, you might only get that 4 value for the 5 provisions, which isn't very good. So it's not all black and white. There's a lot of complexity in terms of deciding whether a card is good enough to run into your deck. You got to think about what's in the meta, how often my card is going to get me that good value to provisions ratio, and how often it's going to fall below that curve. So hopefully this was a very helpful for you guys in terms of figuring out what cards are good and what cards are not. Understanding this is a really great start to improving your gameplay and deck building skills. Always try to maximize the value for each and every one of your cards through deck building and also while you're playing. And hope that this was helpful for you guys, and see you next time in the Aretuza Academy.